Welcome to the Earth Keepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earth care should be integrated into every aspect of life, and for many in the Earth Keepers community, that includes our spiritual lives. Welcome, friends, to the Earth Keepers podcast. Hey, Earth Keepers. So much attention as of late has been paid to the heretofore secret lives of trees. In recent years, even as we've witnessed the terrible destruction of tree habitats and the decimation of forests, we've also learned about the crucial role that trees play in climate stability and about the ways that trees actually communicate with one another in vast collaborative communities. Well, in this episode, we'll talk with Leah Rampy and Beth Norcross about their new book called Discovering the Spiritual Wisdom of Trees. This book is a fascinating combination of well-researched revelations about the nature and behavior of trees, balanced with contemplative musings and spiritual practices meant to help us humans connect to and learn from these arboreal, more-than-human relatives. Beth, Leah, welcome to the podcast. And thank you so much for taking time to talk about your new book called Discovering the Spiritual Wisdom of Trees. If I could, let me ask each of you to orient our listeners a bit by telling us about the places and the ecologies where you live, and then perhaps give us a sense of the kinds of earth care activities that you're invested in these days. Leah, let's start with you.
Sure. Well, I live on the Potomac River in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, and it is a beautiful area that is karst topography, so there's a lot of drinking from the same cup that your neighbor does, a lot of caverns in this area. And I live in a co-housing community, so one of our values is earth care, along with supporting each other by being in community and caring for individuals in the collective. Part of what I'm involved in is a small group that I helped co-found about 5 years ago called Save Our Soil. And we are attentive to not only the soil health, regenerative agriculture, whether we can encourage people to plant native plants in their lawns instead of grass, but also local food and encouraging both the buying and the growing of that. So that's one of the things that I'm deeply involved in and love doing.
How about you, Beth?
Hi, Forrest. What a pleasure to be here with you. As I said earlier, I've been looking at your website. So many interesting projects you've got going. I live here in the Potomac River watershed, the home of the Piscataway, the traditional home of the Piscataway. And I like to tell people I live about 4 miles from the White House. So there are vibes coming in and out here. I am just stepped down from my role as executive director of the Center for Spirituality and Nature. And so we've published this book, and I'm looking and discerning what my next steps are. I think at this point, continuing to, in terms of earth care, continuing to lead programs and retreats, getting people to engage in relationship building with earth as a precursor or as an integral part of earth care. I think that's where my work is right now.
Yeah, the Center for Spirituality and Nature shows up right on the cover of the book, and that makes me curious. What is that about?
Well, I started the center 10 years ago. I came out of the environmental community and the earth care organizations, if you will, helped start the Green Seminary Initiative and so forth. But what I saw in those, both in the secular and the faith-based movements, we were all about action and activity, which was terrific up to a point. But it felt to me like we were missing a really substantial and substantive part of earth care, which, as I said earlier, was grounding ourselves first and foremost in relationship and really expecting to find spirit there. And so that's what the center did and does. It encourages people to go back into what Leah likes to call the living world. I love that. To reestablish ourselves as kin with the living world, and to deepen our sense of soul and spirituality and spirit while there.
Well, let me ask both of you this next question. If you think about the general purposes and hopes that you have for this book, what is your hope in terms of how readers will be impacted?
Well, I do believe firmly, clearly, that we are inextricably linked to the world around us, that we are within an ecosystem. And I also know that we can forget that. Our culture does not consistently remind us of our deep connections. In fact, there is much about the business as usual that keeps us holding a perspective that we are other than the living world around us. And so that is one of the things that I think we would both say we hope for the book, which is to remind everyone who reads it that they know deep within, they knew probably from childhood, that there was this amazing, beautiful, wonderful world of life and liveliness that they were intrigued by, felt interested in, felt connected to, before that was kind of covered over by a different story. So to remember, to recall that deep connection, and then to be willing to open to the wisdom of the world around us, to learn from the trees, all beings really, but in this case, to learn from the trees who are far older and wiser than we are and have been through a whole lot. They know about resilience. They know about tenacity. They know about bending toward cooperation. I'll let you pick it up from there, Beth.
Yes, all of that. And I think I was trying to remember, I think we finished the manuscript sometime almost a year ago now, I think. And we could not have anticipated the moment that we would find ourselves in right now. But our hope was, and certainly is even more today, that the trees will inspire and comfort and heal. And by that, I mean, we were out on a walk with a group this past weekend, and we saw gnarly trees twisting and turning and finding their way somehow still to the light. And people were inspired by the fact that the trees don't always get to go straight to the light, to little L or big L, choose your metaphor. And I think they were inspired by that. And watching the sycamore roots dig into the soil right on the edge of the Potomac River and see the tenacity with which the trees have had to demonstrate given their all the challenges that they've faced. And then, of course, comfort and healing. All we need to do is walk in the woods and we feel better. And I think we need that more than ever right now, this sense of wholeness and kinship, and that there's something that still is predictable and reliable in the midst of the fire hose that we're facing right now.
So the title of your book, Discovering the Spiritual Wisdom of Trees, is evocative, to say the least, and really for the reader implies some important questions from the get-go. So, Leah, let me ask you, what do you mean by the term spiritual wisdom?
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, that's a term that we mention in the book, can be one that could be both confusing to people, but also inviting. And as you said, evocative. We understand that spirituality means very different things to different people. And we understand that when we speak about it, we're really imagining that sacred space where there is this overarching, and you could use whatever capital word you want, love, light, this creation in which we live, the being in which we live and move and have our being, that there is this deep connection that we have in which we are acting and in which all are held. And that can go by many different names. But that's what we're saying when we talk about, or at least what I'm saying when I talk about spirituality. And others will have maybe some subset of that or maybe something slightly different. We think even within that, there is still wisdom that trees hold. So this goes back a little bit to the work of Robin Wall Kimmerer, who reminds us that all of the beings on this earth have their own unique and powerful wisdom. And because we are the younger brothers and sisters in the cosmic story, we have much to learn from those who have gone before. We have found that to be true. We taught, you mentioned about why the Center for Spirituality and Nature is on the cover. Beth and I started teaching a class 5 years ago through the center on the spiritual wisdom of trees. And so we developed that as a 6-program course and then collaborated to offer that independently, but also we'd invite people to come in and Zoom with us. So what we invited people to do is go to a tree, breathe with a tree, listen deeply, open one's heart and senses, because the wisdom of a tree is not going to come to us through English, but it can come through us and to us in amazing and wonderful and insightful ways when we get out of our heads or do as the contemplatives might say, mind and heart, and open to deep listening and awareness.
Leah, I think it was important to us both, Forrest, that we talk a little bit about what we mean when we say spirituality. So we line that up in the first part of the book, as you said. So it's an incredibly personal concept, and we wanted people not to necessarily adopt our stance, but we wanted them to know our stance. And part of spirituality, I think for us, and I'm going to speak for both of us, is this sense that there is presence entwined in all of earth, and that this presence, this sacred presence, is available to us and to each other in each element of what one might call the creation or the ecosystem and so forth. And that there is a unity within this presence that binds all together. And I would only add that our sense of spirituality is that as we hope to become more spiritually deep, it's where the deepest, most essential sense of myself meets the most essential part of you, or a tree, or a frog, or a butterfly. What is that essential nature? And where can that meet your essential nature? That's what spirituality means to me, and I think to both of us. That was a difficult chapter to write because we wanted to be really clear about what we meant and what we were inviting.
It does seem we're always writing at the edge of understanding and writing at the edge of what language will allow us to do.
Well, let me ask, too, about the word trees in the title. I mean, why trees? Are they somehow wiser than other more than human beings in the community of creation?
Well, I think Leah and I are both inveterate tree lovers, and so we wanted to start from our place of passion. Certainly, it's an element of the living world where I find myself very spiritually attuned, and I think Leah does as well. But as Leah said, we taught this class based on some of that understanding and passion, and we were just so moved and touched by the hundreds of people who came through the class, and were also so moved and touched by trees. There is something about a sequoia or a redwood or a scrawny little, as we call it, Charlie Brown Christmas tree. There is something that's very moving, and that I think we sense our kinship there. And the wisdom, as we kept wandering in the woods, the wisdom was so apparent. That's where we wanted to start looking.
Beth is right. I think it comes out of our own passion and our own desire for deeper understanding. And for certain, I believe you could write about the spiritual wisdom of frogs and butterflies and bees. And we know many people have written about the wisdom of various different beings in this amazing planet. Water has its own essence that's very different from a standing in place spiritual being. So I think, too, I would say that once you open to trees, you also have that potential to open to the amazing capacity of connecting, as Beth is talking about, connecting soul to soul with the living world.
Beth, I'm curious about how this project came about, or maybe more importantly, how you came to collaborate with Leah on this project.
Well, we had, as Leah said, we met some years ago around our mutual love and understanding of the natural world. And Leah was on the board of the center for many years when I served as ED. And we were wanting to write together using our mutual and respective gifts. And the idea of our understanding of trees as these wise elders was something that we mutually held. We started by doing this class and then realized how they touched others, as I said, and we wanted to do more. There was more that we thought we could offer and say, and then were approached by Broadleaf Books and asked if we wanted to write a book, and we took about 5 seconds and said yes.
I'm wondering if you could describe a strength or a unique perspective that Leah brings to this book project, and maybe even read an excerpt from a section that exemplifies that.
Well, I would love to do that. I think so highly of Leah for so many ways. I think the thing I'd like to suggest for today's discussion is her ability to, I think at her heart, she's a contemplative, and she's thought and reflected deeply about what it means to be soulful and soul-filled, and how that intersects with her passion and her understanding of the natural world. And as you can tell in this brief discussion, she has an elegance in her language that is lovely and touching and also reaches people so poignantly. So there were a couple of things that I had picked out, and she says in her, I think one of the chapters that I liked the most, or I found most helpful in Leah's writing, and we did read each other's chapters and edit, but we decided that we would use this back and forth format because our voices were so different. She says in the Holding Loss and Bearing Witness chapter, to build relationships with trees, to know a tree as kin, to fall in love with a forest, is to become vulnerable to loss. Once we open our hearts to new ways of seeing, the drawbridge is down and grief can gain entrance. The artifice that we've cultivated to set us apart from other species, to insist that we are separate, unique, or even superior to them, no longer makes sense. As our paradigm of separateness begins to crumble, we feel more deeply what happens to other beings. We might say that in cracking open, we become more authentically ourselves as members of the earth family. Like a tree who demonstrates the paradox of being a single entity while deeply intertwined with multitudes, we are both individual and collective. This paragraph and so many other paragraphs she wrote just bespeaks a very deep and wise understanding of our relationship with both spirit and the living world. And I really cherish being in this conversation with her as we wrote the book.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. Leah, how about you? How would you describe the unique contributions that Beth brings to the book, and what might you read to exemplify that?
Well, Forrest, first I want to thank you because this is a very touching and almost vulnerable place to be in. And so thank you for inviting this. And thank you, Beth. We complement each other a lot, but we don't hesitate to tell each other about how honored we feel to work together and how much we appreciate each other's work. It's also nice to hear that in front of someone else. So what I would say is that Beth has such a deep heart for this work and has led so many people on walks through the forest, just pointing out in real time what's there. Her background in forestry brings this depth of understanding of the ecology of trees in a forest, and that gets held up to bring awe and wonder to the conversation. So it's never stops with the ecology. It moves into that invitation into how does this land for my heart, my soul, So I really appreciate that. Plus, we're really fun together. So there's so much I could read, but let me set this up a little bit. Beth and her husband have 12 acres that they steward in the Blue Ridge Mountains. And she talks about when they first got there, the immense amount of work they had to do with old trailers there. And then once you move all of the rubbish off the land, you find that it's not particularly natural. It has been sort of left to its own devices, or grass was planted or whatever. And so they wanted to restore that land to be more natural. But she says at some point we ran out of steam. So they were gone for a period of time, and then I'll read a little bit. One day, after a long absence, we pulled up the gravel drive and realized that what had been a lawn was no longer such. At least 50 tiny 2-foot-high trees, Virginia pine and cedar, had established themselves through natural regeneration. Various animals and the wind had most likely picked up seeds from nearby conifers and dropped them on the grassy area. Rain had buried them in the soil, and voila, a forest was forming. These prototypical pine and cedar pioneer species, typically the first trees to come into a disturbed area, had moved in and taken over with absolutely no assistance from us. And then she goes on to talk about the growth of that forest, but I want to read sort of how this resolves itself. For so many years, my husband and I couldn't imagine that in the soil beneath this once lawn, something magical was happening. Beyond our seeing, beyond our knowing, a forest was being reestablished. I kept wondering, what else is happening beyond our sight? What other tricks does nature have up her sleeve? I can't help but wonder what miracles might be brewing beyond my imagination as mystery and nature collaborate. While hope calls us to participate actively in the renewal of a forest, it also beckons us to stop, slow down, and pay attention to the miracles unfolding all around us without any effort from us. We live into hope by knowing and trusting that there are forces at play beyond our sight and beyond our knowledge that are moving Earth and all her creatures toward reconciliation and rebirth. So to me, that's such a beautiful passage that shows a bit of both Beth's knowledge of the forest and how the forest evolves, and also the sense of a deep spiritual heart that claims hope, reconciliation, rebirth.
Thank you, Leah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate the balance between these two perspectives. And I noticed that initially I was trying to nail down this really important phrase that you just used, Leah, and that is paying attention, right? That it's clear that that's the central practice of discovering the spiritual wisdom of trees. But I realized that it was multiple things. That paying attention, on the one hand, especially when you talk about it, Leah, was very much about contemplation, meditation, seeking more of a spiritual or numinous connection. And I think, Beth, what you were very good at is emphasizing the importance that paying attention is also learning. There's factual learning to be done. There's experiential learning to be done. And that the more we know about a system, about growth patterns, about what goes on below the soil, I think the better enabled we are to listen even further on multiple levels. So for me, that balance in the definition of paying attention felt very important. I wonder, maybe Beth, if you could explain more about how you understand what paying attention is. In terms of this way of seeking understanding, how would you describe paying attention from your experience?
Well, I think that's a lovely summary of our chapters. I will say I think Leah could probably have taken it from my perspective as well, and perhaps I hers. I think this is where we divided it up, if you will. But for me, from the standpoint of the science or the ecology, it's really a matter of getting to know another entity. And Leah speaks eloquently in the book about this othering that we do to other people, to other creatures, to the earth versus humans. And so some part of, to me, of the science and the ecology is really just starting that relationship with getting to know another. How do you grow? And we have an exercise in the book. I think, what is it like to be you? So this getting to know one another as we would if I first met, your name is Forrest, that's interesting. Where'd that come from? So we also approach another species in much the same way. The other thing, though, for me anyway, is that it's so darned interesting and exciting, and it's wondrous. I mean, the way water moves up a tree, it's really wild. And so it's exciting and interesting. And as Leah said, the wonder and awe come out of that experience. And the spiritual comes out of that place where science leads us to spirit. I encourage people in our programs to get to know the species or the trees in your own backyard. What's back there? Learn their names. How do they operate? It's part of knowing someone deeply, I think. That's where the science and the ecology come in for me.
Beth, let me ask you, obviously one of the core purposes of the Earth Keepers podcast is to motivate and equip people for action. So specifically action that makes a difference in the health of the ecologies wherever our listeners live. How do you think this book can lead people to action or advocacy for the environment?
Well, it is certainly one of our many hopes for the book. We've seen this firsthand, that I think it was John Seed who said, we're not going to save what we don't love. And we would back that up and say, we're not going to love what we don't see, what we're not in relationship with. And as I said earlier, I come out of the environmental community and the faith and ecology community. And what we've seen time and time again is building these deep, attentive relationships builds that love and that desire to protect and nurture and join with the earth to save her, to act in her behalf and gain the wisdom that we can gain from the forest herself. What I think we don't want to do is move out with the same hubris that got us into this mess to begin with. So sitting and listening in a contemplative stance with the trees breeds an openness to listening to what they might want for Earth, and again, in getting to know them and beginning this loving, engaged, active relationship. And we've seen this with the filmmaker who did our video series. We've seen as she has become more engaged in the contemplative, she's ripped her yard apart of all the non-native species are gone. She's driving an electric car. And it came out of this relationship that she was forming with Earth. this being as a way of moving to acting. I think we've both seen that. And in my many years of earth saving, earth care, it's become more and more apparent to me anyway that we need to always include the being part of this relationship.
Leah, I wonder if you could comment on that, the balance or maybe the interplay between contemplation and action when it comes to earth care.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Sometimes I think we might even say it's contemplation in action. I use this a lot, the term Mobius strip. I think of the place of contemplation in action where we have that opportunity to be open, present, connected. And then how do we take that open, present connection into what we're invited to do? And that, I think both of those live together. They belong together. They're incredibly important. And that doesn't mean that sometimes our actions are not more. I've got to pull back. I've got to sit down. I've got to deepen my own openness and availability. And then as we move into action, we may be saying, I've got to engage more of my thinking, rational mind because I understand. I now have discerned what I'm invited to do. And to live into this discernment may require that I try to figure out what our local government is doing when they say that they want to take this land and build a data center on it instead of maintaining a forest. So I'm coming from this place of deep discernment and hopefully deep connection. And as Beth has already said, deep listening to what is being invited by the land, by the trees, by the waters themselves. And then understanding to the best I can, because I never will fully understand, but understanding to the best of my capacity, then I move that into action on behalf of those who cannot move and who do not sit on boards and are not allowed to vote.
I might just add, when I was ED of the center, we spent a lot of time looking at the change literature, and of which there's a lot. There are really interesting things going on at George Mason and at Yale, which you're probably familiar with. All of that suggests time and again that we will be moved less by intellectual arguments and more by emotional connections. It's important that intellectual and that moral imperatives, particularly that people of faith bring to this, but it may be equally important too to touch people's hearts. In all of our retreats that Leah and I read, we ask people to relate stories of the natural world and of the trees. And they all have stories of a grandfather and a grandmother took them out on a walk and so forth and so on. To reconnect with that deep emotional heart relationship with the living world can really be an important arrow in the quiver of earth care. I will not be writing a book about Robin Hood anytime soon, as you can tell.
Well, there is another dichotomy, polarity, sort of both and relationship that your book highlights that left me uneasy in a good way. I mean, I like books that disturb me and make me think or rethink assumptions. And this has to do with the sort of different ways of knowing, the metaphorical and the literal. That felt like a really important tension that you held throughout the book, I think in a really insightful way. It's a tension that you acknowledge throughout the book, right from the get-go, and I was glad of, because I think that when we talk about metaphorical understanding that we draw from nature, it's actually something that can potentially be a problem. I think it sometimes prevents us from authentic relationship with more than human beings all around us. Now, let me explain what I mean. I'm still struggling for words because I'm still sorting through this, but often we learn from nature metaphorically, and that's all good. To use trees as an example, trees are made stronger by winds and storms. Some trees actually depend on fire as a part of their life cycle. So metaphorically speaking, we can draw lessons from these examples for our human lives. and we can be inspired to value adversity in our lives and value struggle as an important part of growth sometimes. And again, you bring up a lot of those points in the book. That's in some ways what you mean, I think, by the wisdom of trees. However, and please tell me if you agree with me or not, that kind of metaphor learning is sometimes where people stop. It's where they draw the line between themselves and nature. In fact, I think that when we look at trees simply as object lessons, we really do objectify them. We make them essentially other than us. What I think does not happen enough is a more literal approach to learning that recognizes that trees are not other than us. They are us, and we are them. So I'm hoping that you both can maybe weigh in on this idea of a more literal way of relating to our ecologies better than I can, and maybe share your thoughts about why literal engagement is in some ways a corrective to an overemphasis on metaphorical engagement.
It's a fabulous, fabulous question.
I know. And I'm so glad that you saw that and that you lifted it up. We start right up there in chapter 2 and say that directly, that we mean this both metaphorically and literally. And in part because exactly what you said, there is a way in which when it is represented as entirely metaphorical, we are allowed to hold it at a distance. So I don't have to see that tree as a living being. I see it as a symbol for what is important in my particular life. And therefore, that's also another way in which I'm valuing my life over that of a tree. So there's an example that I will give you that just occurred to me. I write a Substack every week, and I am writing right now on what I was doing on Sunday morning on a retreat that I was leading. As everyone was out walking, I was along the edge of a wood in meadow, and all of a sudden, this flower was right in my face, and I couldn't figure out where the flower came from. I turned, and I finally traced it to a dogwood that was ensnared, really, in grapevine and raspberry brambles and holly, to the point you could barely see it. That tree was being strangled. And yet here was this flower. So that, to me, was an example of both, right? That's metaphorical. You get caught in the brambles and you still lean toward life. And yet, physically, that tree was having its water, its nutrients sapped by the roots of this vine. That vine was so tightly intertwined and then wrapped around the trunk that it was deforming the tree. Its weight breaks the branches. The tree is literally breaking, and still, last winter, packed those little bits of flower and leaf into a bud to hold it out as far as it could go to the light. So I am feeling extremely sad about the condition of this tree as a living being, because it is clearly being strangled. Metaphorically, there's lots of messages we could come up with. But for me, that's an example of a literal life being really slowly and painfully extinguished. Now, maybe, Beth, you want to say something about trees screaming, because that's a chapter that people also are stunned by, but maybe you have something else. I don't want to lead you.
Yes, there is that chapter when some scientists now believe that trees actually, when they're too dry, they haven't had adequate water, that there's a screeching, an internal screeching that happens. And I think it's such an important question, and we try to move back and forth between the metaphorical and the literal. I will say that what we've seen in the field, as we talk about these metaphors, the tree, the strangled tree, or the tree, as I said, that's clinging to the banks, that are so inspiring to people, that can breed compassion, and it can also encourage interconnection. We've seen it work both ways. So when we're talking, for example, I was out with a group a few years ago. We were looking at the buds that were being set in the fall by a hickory tree, I think it was. And we knew that that bud was going to have to survive throughout the winter that was to come, which was expected to be dark and icy and cold. And yet it was holding all the hope for that tree, everything that tree needed for spring. Now, that's metaphorical. But then a recent widow came and she felt such connection with that tree, and that the bud was holding for her hope while she grieved her husband. And at the same time, she had compassion for what that tree was having to go through as well. And so I think if we hold our metaphors lightly, that they can in fact invite connection and compassion. But there is a danger, as you said, of the othering. I will also just quickly say the danger too is seeing, as we approach the wisdom of trees, seeing trees yet again in service to us. Well, gosh, they've given us wood and paper and all these other things. And they can be our wisdom guides too. And so Leah's written this beautiful chapter on reciprocity. Again, inviting us into seeing trees as fellow subjects, that not only do they serve us, but we serve them. Or certainly we need to understand where we might be harming them.
It's also why we use he, she, they when we're speaking about trees, not only because that's actually scientifically true, it's also a practice to remember that they are authentic living beings, not its.
I think because we are so used to overemphasizing the metaphorical engagement with creation, that it is sometimes hard to get our heads around what literal engagement actually looks like. And I did want to follow up with an example of how I was impacted actually by a more literal way of understanding that I drew from this book, from the chapter that's called It's All Connected. My daughter, Kyra, is 22 years old and has lived on her own for a few years now. And since she graduated from college last year, she's been wrestling with vocational questions and basically trying to figure out what to do with her life. So I've encouraged her to explore and experiment, but my approach has been typical American dad in some ways, and it's been kind of hands-off with the assumption that she'll figure it out on her own and that it's good for her to figure it out on her own. But I was challenged by what you wrote in chapter 7, and I do want to read a bit of that. So let me get my book out here. You riff off of some writing by a chap named Ben Rollins, but here's where I'll pick it up. You write, pines can live 600 or 700 years in a healthy forest, where older pines send support to the young saplings. At some point, the process reverses, and the mature trees in turn send nutrients to the aging pines. Sadly, but unsurprisingly, lone pines die much earlier than those in the forest. Indigenous peoples share stories of solitary pines who whispered to humans of their loneliness and asked for companions to be planted nearby. Given all the ways trees depend on each other for well-being, we too might sense the need for kinship being whispered among the trees we have come to know. Trees suffer without relationships, and so do we. The dominant Western culture often lauds self-reliance and independence. A guide for foreigners coming to the U.S. noted that most Americans are trained from early childhood to consider themselves as separate individuals responsible for their own lives and livelihoods, and not as members of families or groups. But if we think that we humans were designed to go it alone, quote unquote, the trees are inviting us to rethink our assumption. And I'll just reiterate this one phrase that really hit me. Trees suffer without relationships, and so do we. The reason that hit me is I think it was a pressing issue, a pressing question that was on my mind, obviously, so I was connecting to that. But what struck me was the idea that allowing my daughter to figure out major life decisions all on her own was actually not the way of the forest, so to speak. As you point out, different generations of trees are deeply interdependent, and that interdependence over the course of their lives is essential to the nature of trees. Correspondingly, because I am part of creation, because I share common DNA with the trees, this sort of interdependence is also an essential part of my true nature. Learning that I need to embrace my interconnectedness isn't just a matter of observing and imitating this dynamic of tree life. Rather, I realized that the interdependence of trees was inherent in me, that I was created to be essentially connected with other beings as well. And while that might seem obvious to you, in that moment it wasn't. It's like it was a surprise. It's like, oh, right? Am I actually my authentic self when I push her out of the nest, so to speak, and tell her to go out on her own? Am I allowing her to be her authentic self? This insight, as I read, made me rethink my stance of objective distance when it comes to helping my daughter find her vocational way in this world, and really made me realize that I need to be way more proactive to offer the resources and wisdom from experience that I have to help her in this important stage of her growth and development. And practically speaking, what that's meant is that we have committed, at least for a time, to spend part of every Monday together. We do craft projects and we cook together, but we also, along the way, talk about important life stuff like savings accounts and relationships, and of course what it means to discover a vocation that she loves and that allows her to serve the world in the way she wants to serve. I guess that's just a long-winded way of saying thank you for opening my eyes in that way, right? That, for me, is very literal in the sense that it was a reminder of who I was made to be, that I am essentially made to be interdependent. And I share that dynamic with the trees. It's not just a lesson I can learn from them. It is a reminder that they are that and I am that as well.
And that all is that. Everything is connected. Everything lives in community.
I'm so appreciative of that. As you know, we're both mothers of adult daughters as well. But I love the way that you express it. It really is not just a metaphor, but it is quite literal for you because you see yourself as a sentient being, that you are, in fact, living in this ecosystem just as a tree is, or you are the tree. That makes it very literal and really important. The lessons seem much more personal when we approach it that way. I was really touched by a book by Bill Brown that he wrote on understanding the Psalms. Maybe Bill Brown's work done in Columbia and Georgia. And he talked about metaphor. He talked about the importance that there's a very deep literal understanding behind any metaphor that needs to be recognized as well, that it isn't just a lesson. There's a literal truth at the base of these metaphors. And I think that's what you were responding to. Thank you for sharing that. That's really lovely. And I wish you all the best.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been fun so far. Yeah.
I remember those days. Yeah, thank you.
Well, interestingly, your approach to your readers is to encourage practice and experience. And in fact, at the end of every chapter, you have a section you call Bringing It Home. Tell us about that stylistic choice.
Well, I think that in all of our work, Leah's and my work over the many years that we've been involved in this, the words are interesting and important, but it's the experience where they're grounded. And we really wanted to introduce to our readers many of the practices that we found to be particularly helpful to the folks whom we've been in relationship with. And not only for the humans, but also in deepening their relationship and, again, their actions in behalf of the trees. And so there was some conversation about our gathering them up and putting them together after the fact in a separate kind of a guide, spiritual guide. But it was so important for both Leah and me to ground all the words and the science and all this stuff in the experience. And we're hearing from people. We just heard from one this morning, the new director of the Center for Spirituality and Nature, who found those practices in addition to the words. We're trying to approach this from head and heart and feet, if you will.
Leah, thinking about what our listeners have heard in this conversation, how might you encourage them to bring it home? What would you like them to take away?
Well, whether they read our book or not, and of course we'd love it if they did, but whether they read our book or not, we hope that they will pause and stand, sit before a tree, breathe with a tree, touch the bark, tune all senses to that tree, linger there, linger. See what you can see with a soft gaze. Simply be present to a particular tree. And then ask that tree, what's it like to be you? What's it like to be you? And listen. A retreat I was leading this last weekend, I said, and if you have a hard time with this and this feels a little foolish to you, pretend that it's actually true. Pretend that it's true. This particular tree to which you are drawn has wisdom for you. And act as if that is true. And stay with that tree for as long as he or she allows you to, or for as long as it feels right to you. And then come back again and again, because wisdom, think about our teachers, and we use the term anamkara as well. I mean, it can be a tree teacher, it can be a soul friend. You wouldn't go to a spiritual director once and say, I'm done now. You want to go to that tree trusting that over time the relationship deepens, and over time you hold the wisdom of the tree and the tree holds you in community.
We've been in conversation with Beth Norcross and Leah Rampy about their new book, Discovering the Spiritual Wisdom of Trees. To learn more about their writing and about the Center for Spirituality in Nature, check out the show notes for this episode on the Earthkeepers website. Also, just a note about the coming weeks, when for at least one episode, we'll be re-releasing one of our best conversations from past years. You see, this has been a somewhat trying time for me in recent days, with my transition out of my job at Pacific Rim Institute and the very recent death of a parent. I'm finding that I really need to take a break from the podcast to take care of some important things in my life and frankly, to find some personal restoration. In so doing, I'm wholeheartedly entrusting myself to the patience and grace of those of you who are faithful, regular listeners to the podcast. I'm taking a moment now to ask those friends who join me every couple of weeks to stand with me while I step back to seek some healing and, I hope, some new vision. I'll let you know how it goes. Earthkeepers Podcast is a production of Circlewood, an organization that encourages people to pursue a more ecologically conscious faith. Our executive producer is James Amadon, and our sound engineer is Dave Olfers. Lana Rasmussen is our podcast editor, and Jesselyn Gentry is our social media coordinator. Forrest Reed is the composer of our original music, and I'm Forrest Dinsley, your podcast host. Thank you, friends, for listening, and I hope you'll join us again for our next episode of the Earthkeepers Podcast.